Hello, this is John Paul from the MSA R&D team, and today we're going to talk about the feature update for the MSA 1050 and 2050 storage systems, specifically firmware version VE270 and VL270. This release of the MSA family firmware is not only to introduce new features and fix issues, it's also to enhance the customer installation and configuration experience. Often in reviewing customer issues, we find that customers continue to experience problems that have previously been resolved with firmware upgrades. We also find that a skip step during the initial installation can have detrimental effects in the system lifespan. To help in the customer experience and to try to avoid common pitfalls in configuration, we are now requiring a system settings walkthrough, which we call guided configuration. The guided configuration will only present on new installations. This firmware release offers a couple of feature enhancements. We are pleased to offer the ability to connect to a Microsoft Windows 2016 or 2012 R2 Active Directory for user authentication. Also as an added feature is the I/O workload graph. The I/O workload graph is an extension of the Flash Advisor program offered on the MSA family. This workload graph can be used to give an overview of the MSA's view of data patterns over time. The final feature enhancement is to improve the random performance capabilities of the MSA 1050. First, we'll walk through the guided configuration and the required visits. For factory new HPE MSA 1050 and MSA 2050-2052 systems, the user will be initially taken to a new welcome screen presented in the home topic. The customer will be guided with required visits through the best practices while setting up their storage system for the first time. Once all required visits are completed, the customer can click a link to bring up the familiar home page of the MSA family V3 System Management Utility. The bolded and asterisk bullet items on this page are required: firmware upgrade, user management, installing licenses, setting the alert notifications, and on some systems, adjusting port settings. This is the welcome page. Until all the required visits are complete, every time you click on the home topic in the left side of the screen, you will be presented with this welcome. This page also presents the system current health state. If the system health is degraded, for example, if a power supply was not connected to a power source, there will be a link to take you to the system topic where the customer can view and resolve any degraded elements. This system health is good. The first required visit is to go to the upgrade firmware page. After clicking the upgrade firmware button on the welcome screen, this is the panel shown. The easiest way to avoid encountering issues which have been previously found and resolved is to stay current on the latest available firmware releases. The first thing to point out on this panel is the circled green active link at the top. As sometimes finding the current firmware releases has not been the easiest process, our support team has generated a web page specific for the MSA family of arrays, which clearly states the current version of firmware for the controllers and for the expansion enclosures. There are also links on the page to aid in determining the current release of firmware for the disk drives. The user can click through the tabs for controller modules, expansion modules, and disk drives to determine the current versions on the system and compare those to the versions listed on the linked site. If an upgrade is required, the firmware can be downloaded with entitlement directly from the linked site. If your system is up to the current versions of firmware, then there are no actions required on this panel. Simply click the close button to return to the welcome screen. The final setting on this panel is the partner firmware upgrade setting. Partner firmware upgrade is the best practice to be enabled on the MSA 1050 and MSA 2050-2052 systems. This setting will keep both controllers at the same firmware level to keep consistency of features and user experience. Partner firmware upgrade will run a burn to active, which means that if controllers are at different firmware versions, the controller which was running in the system will be the firmware version that the system will resolve to. This may be a firmware downgrade for the new controller. This same page will be available anytime the user clicks to upgrade firmware. We have closed the upgrade firmware panel and are back to the welcome home topic. Notice that the upgrade firmware required visit is now complete. allowing us to move on to the system settings. You can also see in the screen that the system health is degraded. That was done intentionally to demonstrate the button to verify the system health. The alert message on the page states the best practice of solving any degraded issues before proceeding in configuration. The degraded condition is resolved before we move on to the system settings. This is the new view of all system settings. This same panel will appear whenever the customer goes to adjust any of the system settings. We believe that by having all the system settings appear when any one is configured, that it will serve as a reminder to check other system settings. For example, if the customer goes to change the time zone offset to align to a time zone shift, they will also see the notifications and think that they may want to add the new SNMP trap destination that was added to their infrastructure. As we have not completed the guided configuration, you will see some required visits on this page, flagged by the asterisk. Each of these sections must be visited and completed before the customer has the ability to view the standard home topic screen. This panel can be configured like a wizard, where settings are set on each topic and then applied in one click at the end, but the best practice would be to apply each panel as you complete them and before moving on to the next system setting. On this panel, we see the settings for the date and time. Date and time can be entered manually or can be set to an NTP source. Next, the Manage Users topic. On this panel, we see the settings for user management. There are two sub-tabs on this panel, local users and LDAP users. We will go into more detail of the LDAP user configuration a little later. The statement at the top of the panel is directing users toward the best practice of changing all the default user passwords. To change the password for a user, you must first select the user, then set the password and confirm the password, then click Apply. Once that is complete, the asterisk on that user will be removed. The user can also create new local users from this page. It is permitted to delete the default users, but you cannot delete the last managed user from the system. Please review the HPE MSA System Management Utility Reference Guide for the available settings for each user. We'll apply each user password and then move on to the next system setting, installing license. The first thing to note on this panel is the check mark next to the Manage User setting, and that the asterisk is gone. This is the indication that all the required actions have been completed under Manage Users. If you close and reopen the system setting panel, you will no longer see the asterisk next to Manage Users. You will also not see the check mark. The check mark is only viewable while the system setting panel is open after having completed the action. This required visit to the Install License system setting is to help improve the customer experience in finding the information for installing a license, specifically the licensing serial number, which is required to retrieve a license from the HPE licensing portal. For customers who have already purchased the Advanced Data Services license, this should also help to avoid configuration blocks of using both spinning hard drives and solid-state drives in their storage pools on the MSA. At the top of this page is an acknowledgement checkbox, which will complete the required visit without the need to install a license. Customer does not need to buy a license just to complete the required visit. But if they have purchased the Advanced Data Services license, they can use the license serial number shown on the panel to retrieve the Advanced Data Services license through the licensing website. They can then install the license directly here, which will also complete the required visit. I will click the Acknowledge checkbox and move on to the next system setting, Network. Again, the check mark is shown for the completed required visit. On this panel, we can set the management IP addressing mode and IP settings. Please see the HPE MSA Storage Management Utility Reference Guide for details on setting the management IP addresses. Next, system settings, services. The services panel will allow the customers to configure the protocols and services that will be able to manage the system. By default, only the secure protocols have been enabled. If LDAP authentication is enabled, then only secure protocols can be enabled. This is to avoid sending a user's credentials over an unencrypted protocol. For example, an FTP or Telnet session will send username and passwords over the network in plain text. The next system setting is System Information. System Information. The System Information panel allows the customer to set information about the HPE MSA. This information is purely to help identify the MSA. It can be used to help identify the MSA through SNMP or in the logs. The system name also appears in the banner of the System Management Utility. Next system setting, Notifications. Notifications panel is another required visit. The customer can opt out of setting any notifications with the checkbox at the top of the page, but this should be discouraged. In review of customer issues, we have seen some unfortunate cases where customers have not been aware that their HPE MSA has become degraded and have run the system until multiple conditions exist which impact host I/O and data integrity. In requiring a visit to the notifications page, we hope to limit the number of customers who fail to let the storage system notify them of a degraded condition. There are 3 notification protocols which can be configured on this panel: SMTP or email, SNMP, and syslog. Configuring any one of the protocols will complete the required action for notifications. Here's the lower portion of the email alert settings. The top portion on the previous slide showed the email server settings which were required. Here we see the full section of setting the alert level and the email destinations. The next section is the health alerts. This feature has been available in previous firmware versions, but we want to highlight it again. The health alerts are a weekly email from your system which will remind you if the system is degraded, or will let you know that the current health is okay. The lack of receiving a weekly email is also an indication that the MSA requires attention. Finally, there's a test button to validate all settings are correct and that email alerts can be received correctly. Here we show the SNMP settings. This includes the notification level, the trap destination IP addresses, and the read and write community strings. And finally, the test button to test a SNMP trap to validate settings are correct. The third notification protocol which can be used is syslog, and here are the settings. This includes the notification level, the syslog server IP addresses, the syslog protocol port, and finally the test button to send a test syslog event to validate settings are correct. The last tab within the notifications topic is managed logs. The settings here are the email destination, whether to include logs, and finally the test button. Email notifications must be configured for managed logs to function. Managed logs is a notification that the internal array logs are nearing a full state and that the oldest sections will be overwritten. The alerts received can either prompt the customer to gather a set of logs from the array, the pull method, or will attach the log portion that will be overwritten to the notification email, the push method. When an issue occurs on the MSA, the logs are used to look back on when the issue started occurring and also review the details of what was happening. Having all the logs is of great value to the support organization in gathering information and bringing the customer back online in a timely manner. For all the notifications, please review the HPE Storage Management Utility reference guide for the details on the settings. Next system settings, ports. The ports panel does not appear on all MSA systems, namely the MSA 2050-2052 SAS systems. That is because there are no port parameters to configure on these systems. Again, the customer can opt out of making any configuration changes to the host protocol ports, or the customer can configure all details of a port. For Fibre Channel ports, the defaults are typical and recommended. For iSCSI, the IP addresses need to be configured manually in order to allow host connectivity. iSCSI ports can be configured either using IPv4 or IPv6. Configuring for IPv6 and other iSCSI settings, such as CHAP, jumbo frames, and SNS settings, are available in the Advanced Settings tab. For SAN controllers, the host ports can be configured in 3 different states: Fibre Channel, iSCSI, or Fibre Channel and iSCSI. Within the MSA Quick Specs is a table detailing all the options for host port protocols. The host port mode setting had previously been a CLI only option. It's now here under Set Host Port Mode in a required visit to create a better customer experience. Please see the HPE Storage Management Utility Reference Guide for more information on port settings and overall system settings. Here are the advanced port settings. For more information on setting these, please see the HPE MSA Storage Management Utility Reference Guide. Next, we'll move on to LDAP support. With the firmware upgrade to VE270 or VL270, customers now have a new feature that will give them the option to authenticate users with an existing Windows Active Directory running on Windows 2016 or Windows 2012 R2. Other implementations of LDAP servers have not been tested or qualified. To configure LDAP, there are a number of parameters of the Active Directory infrastructure and schema which need to be configured. These include the IP addresses of a primary and alternate server to use for authentication, the port to be used, and the user search space for the user's domain. The user groups on the MSA are what provide access or deny access. These will need to be named exactly as the Active Directory group that is created or used. A new MSA management role called Standard has been created to allow authenticated LDAP users to manage the MSA, but not allow operations which could impede traceability. Which brings us to the final part of the LDAP integration, traceability and the audit log. This is where all management interaction, including login, failed logins, settings changes, and provisioning changes are tracked. Each controller will maintain an individual audit log of a maximum size of 2 megabytes. The audit log can be reviewed in the CLI only. Both the CLI on the A controller and the B controller will need to be accessed to see all management interactions on the system, as each controller will only show their own management interactions. Here's the view of the LDAP configuration in the System Management Utility. To complete this page, you will need to know details about the Active Directory servers. On this page, you can see we have entered server IP addresses for both a primary and alternate Active Directory server. We have accepted the default port of 636, a secure port. We have set the user search base to OU equal users, DC equal bigco, DC equal com. This would start the search in the organizational unit users in the bigco.com domain. Active directories can be very large, including hundreds of thousands of users, groups, computers, and other objects. In order to speed the operation of finding a user in the directory, the customer will provide a starting point inside the Active Directory to narrow the focus. That is done using a user search base. In a typical Active Directory, user accounts will be contained in an organizational unit structure hierarchy. Also on this page, we have added 3 user groups: MSA Admins, MSA Manage, MSA Monitor. These groups must be separately created within the Active Directory, and users must be made members of the groups. The difference in the groups shown is the roles which have been assigned. MSA Manage has the familiar Manage role, allowed to fully manage the array. The MSA Monitor has the Monitor role and is only allowed to view the configuration. The MSA Admins groups has the new Standard role. This role will allow the capabilities of the Manage role, except for user management, write operations performed through FTP or SFTP, and file uploads from WBI and restore default commands. These same roles can be applied to local users and LDAP users. The preferences are the same preferences that exist for local users. Setting these will change how the management interfaces present information. For example, base 2 versus base 10 for capacity sizes, and Celsius versus Fahrenheit for temperature readings. More information on the preferences is available in the HPE MSA System Management Utility Reference Guide. The MSA does not retain any Active Directory credentials to query the LDAP server. It relies on the credentials supplied during login to contact the Active Directory and return the information required. The supplied credentials will be compared to local users first. then to the primary Active Directory server, and finally to the alternate Active Directory server. The supplied credentials are used to authenticate into the Active Directory and query for the user's group membership. Only the first 100 groups are returned. The MSA then compares the user group names returned with the user group names created on the MSA. The user will then get the permissions of the first group which matches. If a user is a member of more than one MSA user group with different roles, then the permissions may change each time the user logs into the MSA. Users should be allowed to log on to the Active Directory, should not be a member of more than 100 groups, and should only be a member of one group, which is also a user group on the MSA. This process allows the MSA to authenticate against Active Directory users without the complexity of joining the domain. The top of the screen shows a snip of the audit log. There's all the information about the attempted interaction encoded in each line, starting with the date and time of the attempted action, an internal ID, the process which was accessed. Here we have logins to both SSH protocol and the system management utility, along with a failed login from bigco/joe on SSH. The controller which was accessed, the user accessing and running commands. Here we are just showing a command which is provisioning storage and a failed login, which were also shown on the previous slide. Going to the next part of the string, returns takes us to the GID, the group ID. As these commands were run with local users, there are no groups. Next, the session ID, the action taken, addition of a disk group, and a login attempt, the host IP, the system accessing the MSA, the subsystem, the return code, and finally, a message if a return message is necessary. With this information, the user can trace what actions have been taken on the array, when, and by whom. This log is unique per controller and has a maximum size of 2 megabytes. Depending on management usage, the time covered in the audit log will differ. Next section is I/O workload. Access to the I/O workloads is available in the main view footer and therefore accessible from any topic. The I/O workload is circled on this slide, and we will go through the details on what information is included in the I/O workload in the next couple of slides. The I/O workload graphs are a benefit with the move to virtualized storage on the MSA family. With virtual storage, the MSA is allocating host logical block addresses requests into 4 megabyte pages. Each access to a page is tracked so that the tiering algorithm can move pages to the correct tier. This process happens even if there is only a single tier. Using this access information, the MSA can determine which pages are being accessed and how many times. Putting all that data together into a graph and displaying would be disruptive to normal I/O process. So the MSA logically divides the available pool capacity into 1,000 equal buckets of capacity. The example here is a pool of 20 terabytes, so each bucket would be 20 gigabytes and contain 5,000 of our 4 megabyte pages. The system will then add up all the 4 megabyte page accesses and total them for the bucket. Looking at all the buckets will result in the graph. The I/O workload graph is an extension of the Flash Advisor program and could be an indicator of the value of the SSD capacity currently configured in the MSA, or an indicator that SSD flash capacity increase would help overall performance. The shown two graphs are from the same system, Pool A and Pool B. They are running roughly the same bench test workload. There are 3 graphed lines, 100% of the workload, 80% of the workload, and 50% of the workload. 100% of the workload is an aggregation of all the buckets which have had I/O accesses. Not shown is that these pools are greater than 10 terabytes each. The points for the 100% line are showing that of the 10 terabytes of usable capacity, only 600 gigabytes are being accessed each day. If you move to the 80% line, the data accesses are even more localized, and 80% of the accesses to the 10 terabytes of capacity are occurring on less than 200 gigabytes of data. The 50% line shows even more localized. The first graph is indicating that 80% of the IOs to that pool could have been found in SSD capacity. Remember, could. Each workload will be different, and unique workloads could also have almost all the IOs landing in new pages, which has not yet been moved to an SSD tier. The second graph is indicating that if the customer is looking for more performance or lower latency, then a small investment in 200 gigabytes of SSD capacity could help performance and latency with 80% of the daily IOs. Just to repeat, each workload will be different, and where this graph may seem to very clearly show how much SSD capacity will help, knowledge of the workload from the host side is vital to making the right decision about SSD capacity. Also, be aware that as storage is reconfigured, the workload could change, and what seemed to be the right SSD capacity before is now too small or too large. The last section is the MSA 1050 VE270 performance. With the VE270 firmware release, we have adjusted the hardware settings for the controller to enable higher performance. The higher performance is capable in the controller, but still requires a disk configuration, which is also capable of the higher performance. In the case of random reads and writes, SSDs will be required to attain the maximum performance. There is no additional license or any user setting to be applied. Merely install the new firmware and have a system capable of providing performance on the back end. Customers should not expect to see a change in performance if they have few drives and no SSDs. This chart is showing the sequential throughput available with RAID 10 and RAID 6 on the Fiber Channel MSA 1050 controllers. For the most part, there are only modest performance gains. Now we are looking at the random performance. Again, for the MSA 1050 Fiber Channel controller, but all controllers will benefit from the changes similarly. Here we can see some marked improvement. The performance improvement is typically greater than 25%. The final numbers will be posted in the MSA Quick Specs. Here are some of the helpful links to the previous learnings on the MSA 5th generation systems, and also links to the MSA firmware, documentation, and MSA technical Yammer site.